Okay, thanks for joining us, everybody. My name's Jeff Benyon. I'll introduce myself more in a minute, but with Dan Ellsworth today. And we're introducing a series of presentations on gospel-grounded ministry to LGBT plus identified individuals, what we'll be referring to as sexual minorities. It's a little bit broader term. And this is a difficult topic. It's a sensitive topic. And it's also one where there are some extremes on both sides, where sometimes we can be too harsh and unloving to our brothers and sisters that may be affected by this in whatever way, or in our sincere and good-hearted attempts to be welcoming and accepting, we might inadvertently be leading people astray and away from the saving principles of the gospel. So this is a four-part presentation, but today we're going to talk about one of them, but I'm going to briefly introduce all four of them here before we dive into part one. So in part one, we're going to talk about how we're really talking about two different worldviews, two different ways of seeing and interpreting reality and experiences. And these are the underlying assumptions that are hardly ever discussed and yet are fundamental. And more to the point, as we will see, they're irreconcilable. There is a gospel worldview that is incompatible with the worldview's underlying modern LGBT identity in the sort of political and socio-political sense. So that's part one. We're going to talk about that. Then part two is a way to kind of cross the divide. And instead of these battles, how do we broaden our view of sexuality? There's a lot more complexity than these boxes. I'm an L, or I'm a G, or I'm a B, I'm a T, a Q, I, A plus, right? Why? What's behind needing to add those letters? And if we actually look at sexuality as more complex and more nuanced, it can also be more liberating. So we'll talk about that in ways people probably haven't heard before and probably haven't considered, but I think it's really exciting. So I can't wait to get to that. The third is the restoration model of sexuality. There are two, what I call demonic systems. I call them demonic because I think they were both introduced by the adversary. One in the war in heaven, when he introduced pride, and that was his fall. There was probably pride before that, but it led to all of the war in heaven. And then in the garden, he introduced shame. And so we have these two systems, both separate us from God. And there's a different system that's neither of those, but all too often we ping pong between those two extremes. And so this one will be very helpful to, these first three presentations will be of interest to everybody, I hope. If you're personally affected by this issue, if you know and care for people who are, if you're just a Latter-day Saint who wants to learn more about these topics in a gospel orthodox way, those will all be useful. The third one, particularly if this is your own experience, I try to lay out some great ideas for how to approach this without falling into either of those extremes. And then part four is, how do we minister to our brothers and sisters that experience to this? And all of us are called to do that, but this will be helpful for really any Latter-day Saint, and especially if you're in a leadership position. But since all of us are called to be ministers, hopefully that'll be useful for all of us too. Did I leave anything out there, Dan? Or
no, you did not.
Okay.
Perfect start.
All right. Well, let's dive in then to part one. And here, again, these are some of the goals, again, for all four of these presentations. I want to be able to help us improve our own discipleship, help understand where people are coming from, especially in this part one. You'll see we end up talking past each other a lot because these assumptions are totally different. Love the sinner and hate the sin versus born perfect. These are ways we're going to offend or misunderstand each other when we don't understand where we're coming from. So just being able to understand these assumptions that we never talk about or make explicit, I'm going to try to. And of course, help us be better ministers. And unfortunately, the bad news here is no matter how much love and acceptance, Christ-like discipleship we try to embody, and we need to, that will not cross the divide. This is incompatible. That's not to say that everybody that uses these labels or that is in affiliated with all of these are. But if you take all of the propositions and theories behind traditional morality, including what our church teaches in the Proclamation on the Family, but it's bigger and older than our church even, versus the modern concept of sexuality in it, and we'll trace some of the antecedents. This goes back to the sexual revolution. So this is also bigger than just LGBT. It goes back to the sexual revolution and maybe a little earlier about the role of sexuality, the role of marriage, the role of the body. All of those things will go into that. But they are incompatible. No amount of being nice, being loving, which we need to be both of those, can bridge that. They are incompatible. And if you don't believe me now, hopefully I'll be able to demonstrate that later. But that is the bad news. But the sooner we recognize that, frankly, the easier it'll be. So just a little bit about me. I am 52 years old. I don't like to admit that, but I've been married 18 years and I have one son. He's 14. I've been a lifetime active member of the church, and I had these feelings, but I didn't really admit to them. I had same-sex attraction, feelings of sexual attraction to the same gender that I kind of knew about, but didn't admit to, if that makes sense, even to myself. So if you'd have asked me, are you gay? Are you sexually attracted to men? I'd have said no. And it would have been honest, truthful, but not honest. That's how I'd put it. But on my mission, through some spiritual experiences that you can find elsewhere, I talk about in my Voices of Hope video, the Spirit really led me to just kind of accept this as part of me and come to grips with it. So that started on my mission, which was French-speaking northeastern France and Belgium. I've served in bishoprics and elders' quorums, gospel doctrine, all kinds of things. My day job is real estate development and management, and then I'm also a part-time marriage and family therapist. I've been involved in this issue for 25 years. I've written chapters in books. I helped start a support group in DC, which is where I met my friend Dan. In fact, he came to the group. We'll talk about some of that at some point. I'm one of the co-founders of North Star International, and I'm right now, while this is being recorded, a co-chair on the board of directors. You can watch my Voice of Hope video to find more about my personal story. Did a TV show about Latter-day Saint men with same-sex attraction, many of whom are married to women, which is supposed to be impossible or at least miserable. I also, as part of my work as a therapist, serve on a group called Reconciliation and Growth. And this is a group of therapists who are either gay affirming or Orthodox Latter-day Saint. And so we're coming together to dialogue, see if there's some common ground there for good therapy, no matter what spectrum you come from, because there have been gay people who have been harmed in therapy. They've been told things that are shaming or hurtful, that harm them, lead them to negative places. And they're also believing Latter-day Saints who've been harmed in therapy. Oh, you just need to leave the church. You'll never be happy. Or, oh, your marriage to a woman, if it's a man, won't last. You just need to divorce your wife and go be you and let her free you. Those can also do tremendous damage. So there's damage being done on both sides, and we're trying to come together to say, all right, what are some principles that do that? And it's been really, really great to be part of that exercise. And then obviously, despite all those affiliations, there's plenty of stuff in here, probably most of it that my friends on RGP won't agree with. There's probably some things in here that some people in North Star might not agree with. So this isn't anybody's position except my own. I'm happy to defend it, and I've tried to do the best I can with this, but ultimately only I am responsible for what's here. Anything to add there, Dan?
Nope. I would just only add that it's not very common that we find somebody like Jeff who has just gone through all of life to this point in the church, working through these issues. There are a lot of people who have left and come back after, recognizing their experience of same-sex attraction. And, we're thrilled about that. But Jeff does kind of have a unique position here in that he has been kind of in the trenches in the church this entire time. So very unique voice, and we appreciate it.
Thank you, Dan. We've kind of already introduced these, so I'm just going to skip past these, again, laying out where we're going. And we'll head right into part one. So as I said, the thesis that we're going to defend here is there is an incompatibility with the gospel. The world's ideas about sexual identity are fundamentally incompatible with the gospel. So what happens then is we unthinking in the name of being right, the old extreme, oh, we don't want to talk about this. You're a bad person just because this is part of your experience, right? We want to go from that unfortunate extreme to, oh, I want to be accepting and loving, so I'm going to find out all about this. Well, if you find out about what the Lord says, that will usher you right out of the church. If you adopt all of that unthinkingly, unconsciously, uncritically, that's the danger. And so that's what I want to talk about here. So what is a worldview, Dan?
A worldview is a way of seeing the world. And it's not something that we're generally aware of unless you realize that you have one and you actually interrogate it and say, why do I see the world the way that I do? Why do I think about relationships and life and questions of fairness and good and bad? And why do I think about all of those things the way I do and not the way somebody in a different part of the world thinks about those things?
And we assume everybody has the same worldview, but it's only through the diversity and encountering other cultures that we even come to recognize our worldviews. Like you said, people in other parts of the world, other times have them. But Dan, my worldview has been proven right, and yours has been proven wrong.
Of course.
Are worldviews something that you can empirically prove or disprove?
No. You can only become aware of them.
They are basically pre-empirical, right?
Yes.
They are the scientific method itself is a worldview that is useful and I like, but not all things are necessarily amenable or can be proven that way.
Right.
Or disproven. So what I want to do, I'm not going to try to convince you that my worldview is right, even though I think it is. I have a testimony of that, and I will bear that testimony frequently. But the goal here isn't to convince anybody that mine's right. It's just if you leave this section going, this is my worldview, and you recognize it and see and say, yes, I agree with that assumption. I agree with that assumption. That is what I want for my worldview. Mission accomplished. I just want you to be able to see it rather than just saying, oh, that's the way things are. Oh, this is just the way it is, right? That's just is. Those sort of statements people make show you that they have absorbed a certain worldview. And if we can open our eyes to what our worldviews are, that's great. I'll be really happy. And that presentation by Jeff Thain, we're not going to watch it here, but it's the link to this slides you can download and view. And I encourage you to do that. Click through, watch that presentation by our friend Jeffrey Thain. It's well done. It's brief. It's insightful. It's interesting. It's very well done, very thought out. So watch that, and then you can come back here. So this is what I would call the natural law system, way to put it, or traditional morality. This isn't just the LDS Church that adopted this. This is basically all Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Buddhist, somewhat Hindu, and some even pagan pre-modern systems had these ideas, more or less, all of them. And there's three. I put this in like a sprocket with gears because these all interact. So there's this concept of moral authority, as you can see there. And who is the moral authority? In all those systems, it is God or the gods, in the case of the pagans, right? So in our case, I use this from an LDS standpoint. So in our case, we talk about priesthood authority, who are the Lord's servants who have the keys to reveal truth for the world and the church. We can get our own personal revelation for ourselves and our stewardship, but we accept as Latter-day Saints that the moral authority for what is right, what is good, what we should be doing comes from God and his appointed, anointed servants. Basically, in the pre-modern world, everybody had what you could call a transcendent moral authority, something beyond yourself, something above and beyond yourself. And they're non-negotiable. God said it, right? Done. That's just it. It's there. And it's not something we can change. And you'll hear prophets say that. And you'll hear the other system come back and say something else. So then what is truth? And telos there is a fancy word for the end or purpose. So what is truth and what is the purpose of things? So again, in our worldview, the gospel worldview, truth is eternal and unchanging. Things have a purpose. And for instance, your reproductive system is primarily for, we would say two things, but one is very obvious. You actually don't have a reproductive system. You have half of one. And your half, when joined with a complementary reproductive system, can create children. And so that is the telos of a reproductive system, is to reproduce. And that's what we'd say is evident. This goes back to Aristotle and Plato and things. It's the telos, so the purpose. There's a purpose to our having bodies. There's a purpose to that. And so there's an example. And there's also how we see feelings. These are just some things. Feelings we can feel, we say we feel the Spirit, but we also know we can feel other things that maybe aren't of God. And so in the transcendent natural law moral system, feelings are information. They're interesting. They can lead us to truth, but they won't always lead us to truth. They might also lead us to error. So feelings are not the last word on anything. And then specifically the purpose of divine sexuality, which I've already hinted at here, back to the telos and truth, it is the highest. It's a beautiful expression of the union of a husband and wife, which is reminiscent of and preparatory to our eternal glory that we soon will one day have. How does that sound, Dan?
That works.
Okay.
Yes.
So postmodernism, which started long before the sexual revolution, I'll just say, upends all this. It has a totally different system. And it's no secret where I come down on this, but hopefully I will describe this in a way that anybody that has a system will still say, fair, that's correct. So moral reasoning, instead of moral authority, we've replaced that. This system has replaced that with moral reasoning. So the idea here is you have a brain, and the problem is there's truths here mingled with falsity, in my view. But the difference here, the incompatibility with the other system is that this is the ultimate way to get to truth. I can reason my own moral system. I decide what is right and wrong. And if I read something or somebody says something, I read it in scripture, or heck, it can come down from a lightning bolt. I can say, that doesn't make sense to me. I don't agree with it. I'm not going to do it. And this system says, that's fine. You're the one that decides. And you can reason out your own way to right and wrong. The second thing is feelings are truth. If you feel it, you are it. Any feeling that's sufficiently, and that's a bit vague. I mean, it's not like there's an objective way to measure this, but I think they would still say if a feeling is persistent and insistent enough, then it defines you and it reflects your own truth. So if I feel it strongly enough and I feel it long enough, it's true, for me at least. It's my truth. And another important truth here is sexual fulfillment is one of the most, if not the most important aspects of life. And it's something everybody has a right to. And if you're not getting it right now, you are deprived, and that is unjust. It's like if there was a constitution for postmodern sexual revolution worldview, that would be one of the first amendments. First or second or third amendments would be, you are a sexual being. If you're not sexually fulfilled and sexually happy, you or more likely someone else is doing something wrong that's causing that, and that should change.
And it's not possible to live happily without sexual fulfillment.
That's right. That's right. You are going to be miserable. And if you think
you are happy in that situation, then you have internalized something and you're deluding yourself.
Absolutely. Correct. Yes. Yes. This is, I don't know if they'd say the only way to be happy, but it is certainly necessary for happiness. Maybe not sufficient, but absolutely necessary for your happiness is to express your sexuality in the way that feels natural to you.
Yes.
Yeah. Heteronormativity is homophobic, is how I phrased it here. So what do I mean by that? I need to define these terms for everybody else. Heteronormativity basically is the idea that complementary genders coming together, creating children, forming families is hurtful. That idea is too dominant in society, and therefore it's harming people that don't or can't fit into that mold. And so we need to dethrone heteronormativity and make it not seem normal anymore, or just make it seem no more or less normal than any other kind of sexuality. Right. The assumption that your child, if your new baby's born, you look into his or her eyes and you think, they're going to get married to the opposite sex and have a kid. That is called heteronormativity. And in this view, that is oppressive. To make that assumption is oppressive. We need to overthrow it. And in its place, what we have is any sexual behavior between consenting adults is not just legal or allowed, but good and equally good as anything else. So if you have procreative sexual expression and any other kind of sexual behavior you can think of between any number of people of any kind, it's all the same. There's no one that's better than the other. They're all good. And it's not just neutral. They're basically all good and they're all equally good. Make sense?
Yes, it does.
Okay, so there's a lot more to both of these worldviews, but these are the ones that are relevant to our presentation here. So hopefully you can see the incompatibility between these, but you'll also hear some of the phrases people talk about. You can tell what worldview they're coming from when you hear them talk. Like when you listen to my Voice of Hope video, or you listen to Voice of Hope videos, you'll hear things like, I knew this was what God wanted for me, or God had showed me what he wanted for my life, and I was willing to make sacrifices for that. Now, really, any decision we make has a sacrifice, but that kind of language shows this older traditional system. Other language, if they say, I felt unfulfilled, I felt like something was missing. Again, you can hear some Christians talk this way too. And so you have to listen for a while, but very often they'll talk about fulfillment. I felt deprived. I felt like my mental health was declining. These sort of words, you can tell kind of the worldviews are not necessarily the gospel, though you have to listen for a while because we kind of swim in this vocabulary, even if the worldview isn't there. So let's talk about specifically the gay identity. Now, I want to be careful here. I'm not trying to be the language police. If it sounds like I'm being critical of the gay identity, this word, when someone says I'm gay, it can mean many different things. And this is what the world would define it as if they could be forced to define it. And not everybody that identifies as gay accepts all of these if they're in the church. So that's where you have to interrogate it. But the socio-political construct that is known as gay typically includes, if you just ran as somebody on the street that didn't have a religious background or any familiarity with that traditional morality system, this is what they would mean when they said they were gay, even though this isn't what everybody means. First is, it's got three, so you can think of it as a three-legged stool. It's innate, immutable, and essential. So innate, let's go through each of those. Innate means it's something inborn. So, and these are some things that we're kind of born with and we've always had. So I had 5 fingers on each hand, right? I have this kind of pale, pasty skin. We call it white, but right, other people have the skin we call black, but it's usually more chocolate covered or dark colored, right? It doesn't map onto the Pantone colors, but that is something that sex is something that's definitely innate, right? You're born in a certain sex, and then that through puberty and different things, that develops, but there's a developmental pathway that's set before you're born. Probably when that egg is fertilized, all sorts of cascading things happen that create that. So that's innate. Now, immutable, we can confuse innate and immutable. Immutable means it can't be changed, but that doesn't necessarily mean we were always born with it. And the example I did was paralysis. Now, hopefully science will find cures for paralysis, and there's better rehab than we've ever had. But, at this point in medicine, at a certain point, after you've done so much rehab, you're going to be paralyzed. You're not going to walk. Okay, so that's immutable. The last one is essential, and this is the most important. So let me give you an example. We know from psychology that a lot of temperaments are fairly stable, and we assume that you have them from birth. We don't know for sure because personality tests and stuff, but people's openness to new experience, introversion, extroversion, agreeableness, these are traits that tend to be fairly stable throughout people's lives, and they seem to have had them from as early as we can measure them. So those you're born with, they seem to be stable throughout your life, but we don't have sections in restaurants for introverts and extroverts. Now, some people want to change this, but right now we have men's and women's bathrooms, men's and women's locker rooms, men's and women's sports, best actor, best actress. We do organize the world by gender. Our culture, and perhaps more than that, consider that an essential trait. Race is an interesting one. You're seeing the controversy about that. Should it be as essential as it is? I'm not going to wade in those waters, but you can really see the debate around essentialism when it comes to race, because it's actually about more than your skin color. There's all these constructs around it, which is where most of the debates and disputes and angry and hurt feelings and all that are usually about more than the skin color. It's about some of these essential ideas about that. So I say eye color is another one, right? You've got blue eyes. I've got brown eyes. That's something we can't change. We can wear contact lenses to obscure it, but we don't organize the world based on that. It's something we may notice from time to time. It's something some of us may be attracted to or interested in or like or dislike on a taste basis, but it's not, we don't organize the world. We don't have one house of the Senate for blue-eyed people and one side is for the rest of us or something. So we don't consider that essential. And that's, as you're hopefully seeing, it's somewhat arbitrary. And so the aspects of that then mean, if it is these three things, if being gay, and that's another way to put it. Remember I said being gay, right? The ancient systems would have said, they wouldn't have had this idea of gay. Gay, you might have a certain kind of sexual behavior. It might be something you do, but it wouldn't be something you were. But because it's essential, that essentialist idea says, now this is something you are. Like, I am a man, I am white, I am gay, for example. And what happens then, if you adopt all of these, you see these foundational beliefs, again, of the worldly construct of gay. Not everybody in the church believes these things, but the worldly construct as developed by Michel Foucault and many other thinkers since then, it has these. The revealed purposes, as we would call it, of sexual expression and gender complementarity, what they critique, their critique of it calls that heteronormativity. We would call it the plan of salvation or God's plan of happiness. They reject that. That is not for them, at least, not possible for them, not part of them. They need a different plan, a different place. Heteronormativity is oppressive and it's not for them. It asserts that objective truth and the purposes of our reproductive system are either unknowable or unprovable, and therefore they're subjective to us. I decide what I do with my reproductive system, my half of the reproductive system.
And here's where we might add the term relative.
Yes.
Relativism is where truth is relative and what's right or wrong is relative. It just depends on, what
you're feeling, what you're thinking, what your context is, what your genes or whatever that innate immutable part of you has destined you for something else. But even then you get to interpret it.
Right.
Because if it doesn't make sense to you or whatever, you can reason your way to your truth. And so nobody can tell you what to do. Nobody has any authority over you. And we can see the grain and truth of this, right? We do have our agency to choose whether we follow or not. So there are some hints of truth in here, but you adopt all of these wholeheartedly and you do it. And the real problem with all of this, with the gospel, the conflict comes in the gospel really mostly with the essentialist part of it. If you have decided that your sexual taste, and that's too weak of a word because these are really important things and these are deeply felt feelings. So that sounds dismissive, but we are still talking about a kind the style or type of attraction you experience. That's still all we're talking about, in my view. right? Now, I'm trying to be fair to this other view, but the way I conceive of this is just something I feel, I notice, I do have an attraction that's this way, but what does that define the core of who I am, the eternal core of who I am? There are some gay identified Latter-day Saints who believe, they might not put it in these words, but I think this is still fair, that their intelligence, the matter that makes up their spirit was gay, that there was a different kind of intelligence or a different way they were constituted as spirits that is as co-eternal as their gender or anything else. And that not only were they pre-existently gay, but in the next life, they were also gay. So their spirit, their intelligence was created to be incapable of joyful union with the opposite gendered spirit. And that their creation was, their kind of separate creation was destined so that it could not be joined with the opposite gender and has to be with the same gender. This is where we talk past each other again, because you say to someone that has this essential idea, oh, this is just something you're feeling. It sounds dismissive. It sounds like you effectively have rejected them because they see this as so important and so core to their identity. When you diminish it that way, the way I just did about my own, it feels like you're rejecting them. And we can see parallels, like, again, in racial issues. Oh, I'm colorblind. I don't see race. Well, some people, again, that see that as important to their makeup feel dismissed by that. And again, I'm not really commenting on that here, except to say, if you see this as essential, then things like the plan of salvation can seem oppressive. They can seem like you don't fit in that because in their essentialist worldview, they don't. Whereas on the opposite side, people will hear things from church leaders that they might label homophobic. But in fact, they come from their sincere place of saying, because the tenets of our religion say the gospel is for everybody, right? Bond and free, black and white, male and female. So when church leaders say no blessing will be denied any righteous person, and that you will have a joyful place in the plan, that is meant to be inclusive. That is meant to be for them to say from their worldview, oh, you aren't capable of joyful union with the opposite gender, so we're going to carve out this separate heaven for you. That would be incompatible with our theology, which says everybody can do this, that the celestial kingdom with male and female united in this priestly union is open to everybody. That's what we teach. And so this is where some of the disconnect happens. And this is where some of the friction gets created. If someone's really adopted and internalized this essential worldview, I wish I could put this another way, but I'm just going to say it straight. They will be uncomfortable in church. We still need to be welcoming to them. We still need to invite them. But if they have wholeheartedly adopted this essentialist worldview, it is going to rub them wrong. The gospel, the proclamation on the family, the heteronormativity, as they would put it, of the gospel is going to be off-putting. They're going to feel different. They're going to feel unaccepted. They're going to feel rejected. And they might even project that on others who they say aren't accepting them. But it may, in fact, be that their own essentialist worldview is what's creating it. It's set them up to see themselves as different because it's made this such a big part of their life. And we'll come into some of this when we go into ministry about how to address this. But for now, just notice it and be aware of it. And you'll hear it over and over again when people talk about this. Okay, we're going to take a little detour on queer. I have said over and over again, LGBT plus. You'll notice I left off the Q. And frankly, we're not really talking about the T in this presentation either. So this really only applies to LGB. But I've left off the queer. And why am I hesitant about the queer label? I just want people to understand, if you identify as queer, maybe you just think it's a way to say I feel different, or you think it's maybe a more open way to identify as non-heterosexual. I just want anybody that does that to be aware of its roots. And of course, when I was a kid, you saw I was 52 years old. When I was a kid, this was a slur. So I don't like it for that reason either. But even looking past that, these are some, queer comes from, queer's rehabilitation and use as a term, not as a derogatory term, comes from queer theory. And queer theory has these propositions. It is formulated and was popularized to be an identity without an essence. Now, what does that mean? An identity without an essence. We just talked about essentialism, right? So if I'm gay, the fact that I have a sexual attraction to the same gender means that's important, that's vital. Queer is in fact the opposite of that. It's saying you can adopt this identity which has no substrate, it has no referent, it has no antecedent. I'm using all these big words, Dan, help me. It has nothing it refers to. It right. Deliberately was designed to not refer to something that is has any basis, anything like lasting. Or
I can just announce it and speak it into being. And it's an identity, regardless of what I felt or experienced, for the past 48 years of my life.
Yeah. You can be exclusively heterosexual and identify as queer. What it is intended, so then what is it for? Because it's not just an arbitrary label, like you might wear, a polo label on, you wear a knit shirt and has a polo on it. It's not that either, though. It aims to demolish boundaries. And it is formulated to undermine norms. What any norm is, queer is supposed to undermine any norm whatsoever. So it is anti-normative, I guess we could call it. It is against any norm. It is an anti-identitarian identity. So it is anti-gay. It is anti-gay identity, at least. It is an identity distinguished specifically by its lack of specific content. And sex, sexuality, gender, or even bigger things. As this quote says, it could be in terms of sex, sexuality, and gender. If you feel like you like a certain sexual position that you think isn't normative, or you want to try it or whatever, then you could be queer. But it's trying to push back against any kind of specific referent. Unlike gay identity, queer identity has no necessary specific referent. It's not supposed to specifically refer to anything. It refers to no social or sexual transgression in particular, but it does need to be a transgression. It needs to be transgressive, but it doesn't have to be any sort of specific one. And rather, it emerges only in oppositional relation to specific local norms or sets of norms. So to be queer means to be against whatever the local norm is. So I guess in this country, you should wear an abaya, and if you're in Saudi Arabia, you should not. It can therefore be used in poetry to name a refusal to bring love within the fold of the familiar without imputing to their poems. This is an artist talking about this, either a homosexual specificity on one hand or romantic evasion of the specification on the other. I apologize in advance. Queer theory, like many Marxist derivatives, is opaque and deliberately so. It is meant to be a little confusing, and the jargon is obscure, sometimes deliberately. And so it's not just it's not even a romantic difference. That's what he's saying here. It's the radical incommensurability of love with established social forms. It's saying your love is impossible to have society have a spot for. It's not possible for it to be accepted. And like I say, few people who identify as queer understand that this is a subversive and destructive word.
Its whole purpose is deconstruction, destruction. It's just kind of an acid bath word.
And that's all it is. Yes. And it is meant to make people discontented and unhappy, which we'll see next. So this is the problem. And again, I'm going to offend some people here, but given how it's designed, it's working, is all I'm going to say. So queer theory was an offshoot of Marxism, because they decided that the proletariat, the workers of the world, were not going to rise up. They'd been bought off by the petite bourgeoisie. And so the workers were not going to unite and cause a revolution. So we need to use something else to create revolutionaries than just poor people. So we are going to trouble people's sexuality, make them feel different, make them feel unfulfilled, make them feel disconnected from everything, their own families, but also any kind of system or norm. We're going to disconnect them from that so that they are unhappy, so that they will bring in the revolution. I'm not making this up. So its goal is to make people unhappy and disconnected from their society. And in fact, as we show here, it's working. Identifying as queer is associated with decreased mental health and a progressive political identity, so that political goals are also being achieved. And these two identities are correlated with decreasing mental health, as we said. And the queer level, as we say, is designed to do that. So, and the key reason why you can tell this is not an essential characteristic, right? Like people will say, oh, I was born gay. I used to be gay. Or they don't ever say I'm gay as like a phase or something. It is something that's part of them that's always there. But you'll notice with queer, you can use it as a verb. You can queer something. So I just typed in Google here and put it in queering the, and you can find hundreds of things people are wanting to queer. So we can certainly queer sexuality, we can queer religion, we can queer anything. We can queer schools, we can queer the Bible, we can queer the narrative, we can queer the catalog. It's a project. Queer is a project of subversion. I'm sorry if I offended anybody, but I want you to know, if you've adopted this label, this is who you're putting common cause with. Do you want to talk about this, Dan? Here's two examples of this.
Yes. So what are we looking at with these examples? We have on the left, we have age queer. Here you have the question being asked. So what exactly is age queer? Simply put, it is the refusal to conform to the social constructs of age, namely rejecting the young-old binary, embracing the measurement of time without clinging to the idea that time is linear. Time is not linear. Age is not a binary. All right, so think through the implications of this. What if I can say I'm age queer and I identify as a 10-year-old? Mm-hmm. Think about all of the implications if I demand that society acknowledge that new identity that I'm claiming, right? And if you think that's bizarre or like outlandish, I promise you it's not. I promise you these things are actually happening in society. Mm-hmm. And I'll look at this other example on the right. And this is a heterosexual woman who wrote in a queer anthology of essays. And I want to read what she wrote. She said, I also refuse to entertain the lighthearted critique that my intense attraction to gay male and queer culture is an offshoot of the fact that I'm looking to fail because I'm not ready for a relationship. Instead, I've started to accept the fact that I love and feel comfortable with gay and queer identified men because, wait for it, I am queer myself. And I tout the burgeoning theory of sexual fluidity as my rationale. I suppose I'm finally accepting the notion that there can indeed be straight queers and that it's more than okay for me to define myself as one. So she's heterosexual and claiming queer identity.
And if you understand the history of the term, it makes total sense.
Yep.
If you think Q is just like the L, G, and B, it doesn't make any sense.
Right. So this is a classic example.
Yeah. I can't remember if we were going to play this, Dan. Yeah, we will let you watch this. And we'll just watch this from Fred Sargent. So Fred Sargent is a gay rights pioneer. He was at Stonewall, and he was at a pride parade holding a sign that said, gay, not queer. He understands the difference.
Most of you here don't know me. I'm from Addison County, Vermont. I was the person who came to Burlington 2 weeks ago to protest what Pride has become, a misogynistic, homophobic, exclusionary event. My name is Fred Sargent. I've been a lifelong gay rights advocate and activist. In the fall of 1969, 4 of us went on to propose and then organize the very first Pride March, which was not a parade. No floats, no corporations, no mass contingents of drag queens and other fetishes, which is precisely what Burlington Pride has become. Burlington Pride is no longer even held in June, as it traditionally has been to commemorate the riots that started on June 28. Burlington Pride has now become a platform for misogyny, exclusion, and hate. Gay is now defined by the Pride Center of Vermont as a term of erasure. No member of their team or board identifies as gay, just queer. Queer theory seeks not only to erase societal norms and values, it seeks to erase LGBT people from the movement that they created.
Okay, that's probably good enough.
Yep.
You get a flavor of the fracture, the brewing civil war in these movements. And it's interesting, it's some of the old timers that are kind of getting pushed aside with this acid that you call of queerness that's kind of dissolving everything. So it started with traditional morality, but now it's dissolving gay and lesbian.
Yeah, I mean, think about what he said. The Burlington Pride organization considers gay to be a term of erasure. Why would the Pride organization in Burlington, Vermont, consider gay to be a term of erasure? Well, because it makes a distinction.
Yes.
And it says to be gay, you know, there is a normative understanding of the term gay.
Mm-hmm.
And it is to be attracted to the same gender biologically, you know, somebody with the same biological constitution that you have, right?
With an essentialist idea of gender.
Absolutely.
That males are attracted. If you're gay, you're a male attracted to other males.
Absolutely.
You can see where the T's and the Q's would have problem with that.
Right. Absolutely. And so it makes a distinction, and it says there is a normative definition for this term. Well, the queer movement hates norms of any kind. And so they just bristle at this idea that you use the term gay and it actually means a very specific thing. And that's why they call it a term of erasure. And that's what Fred Sargent and others are protesting against.
Yeah. And they're not winning either.
Right.
We've talked about how it doesn't seem to be in any of these people's power to stop, say this far and no further. Right. It just doesn't seem like that's working. And here's another example that, Dan, you call this sexual and gender entropy, but what was wrong with the pride flag? It was invented. I've gone in the history elsewhere. It was invented in San Francisco by some buddies of Harvey Milk. And it had those 7 colors, but some people left out. So we had to add some colors and some more colors and some more colors and some more individual colors. So you can have your own individual pride flag if you're transgender or a maverick or whatever. And then we've done this, which I don't want to sound too critical, but if I was prone to epilepsy, I might have a seizure looking at that.
I don't even know how to look at that.
Right. That's supposed to be a super inclusive thing. We've got the pronouns. So we've got she, her, hers, herself, he, him, his, himself, they, them. We've got they there. Then we've got z, zir, zir, self, here, self. But that's not enough. So we've got these genders. This is the thing. If you say sex is a spectrum, then some people will then go further and say, I'm not even on the spectrum. So now we're back to a gender binary of those on the spectrum and those off the spectrum.
Yep.
So it gets incredibly complicated. So here's, there's a talk about furries, which it turns out there's furries, not just one. I mean, that's too broad of a term. Furry, as we see by this definition, is a part of the anthro-animal fandom. So it should be, I guess, anthropomorph. Well, that's an animal that can be human-like, I guess. And then the opposite is a furry, a human that feels like an animal. Kenominmami, a human with ears and tail of an animal, but no other parts. Nekomimi is a human with ears and tails of a feline. Specifically, there's tars, quadrupeds, ferals, otherkins. Otherkins is a fantasy creature like an elf or an orc or a dwarf. A therian feels more, may not present as a furry, but maybe identifies more with a different species than human. So this just, we'll see more of this, more fine and finer distinctions as this goes through here.
Yeah. And if you're not familiar with the term entropy, entropy just means kind of chaos, the natural order of things, that things deteriorate and disintegrate, and that's just kind of chaos in the universe. And that's the way things go. And yeah, that's what we're seeing. And the queer movement is all about entropy. There cannot be distinctions. And if one is made, then it doesn't last even a week before it is obliterated by something else. And it's just this constant self-devouring mechanism.
And so the question, if you are, of this progressive LGBT Q plus identified ally or one of these people, where's your limiting principle?
Yeah.
Right? Do you end, like I was talking to a colleague in therapy about this, and that therapist said, well, gender is really essential. So let's not think about these other kins and these furries. That might be a thing. It might not be a thing, but it's not as important as gender. I'm not sure an otherkin or a furry would agree.
Right.
I think they might feel oppressed by that formulation. I don't have a lot of experience with this, but the one or two furries I've talked to feel that that's as essential, if not more so, than their gender. That's why they want the pronouns. So where do you stop? Will you accept all these, but not maybe age queer? So that someone who's 60 identifies as a 10-year-old and therefore should be able to have relationships with other 10-year-olds. Do you draw the line there?
Right.
Where's your line? Where do you say this far and no further?
What principle do you employ to draw a line?
Yeah, that's right.
And say, okay, these behaviors are psychologically healthy and these ones are not. These notions of identity reflect reality. These ones do not. What principle do you employ to draw those kinds of lines?
And if there's no moral authority, we have to try to convince people through their moral reasoning that we're right. Anyway, it becomes quite difficult. It becomes quite a babble of different voices, all of which are equally valid according to this moral system.
Sure.
So long as you feel it strongly enough. And so then it becomes a contest of power, which is, again, a very Marxist and queer idea where it's about power.
Everything is a power struggle framed in terms of power.
Yeah. So this can have some real consequences. So I want to tell you about a friend of mine who, her daughter, of all things, was on Pinterest. Now, we've heard about TikTok and Tumblr, but I've never heard about Pinterest. But this friend's daughter got on Pinterest and decided, and she was 13, she went through all the different flags that I just went through, all the different identities. She was feeling different. She was feeling not understood by her parents or peers. And that's right. She had a lot of things that were kind of unique about her that did set her apart. It made it hard for her to connect with other people. So she starts inventorying her feelings. And again, that's part of this worldview. Look inside, explore what you are inside, and think really hard, and you'll come to one. And you might be wrong, and you can always change it. But if you change it, it's because you didn't really dig deep enough, right? You were always that thing, but you just, you can make a mistake. You're allowed to make a mistake, but if you do, you were always that other thing that you eventually were. So she thinks about it. She looks at all the flags, and she decides that she is an polyromantic asexual, which, so far as I can tell, means romantic interest in lots of different people, but kind of uninterested in sex. And when I looked that up, I'm like, oh my gosh, she's just a 13-year-old girl.
Yeah.
There's a lot of 13-year-old girls who are boy crazy, who are girl crazy, who just want all these friendships and they're kind of boy crazy, but sex is kind of weird and maybe scary and confusing and ooh. So
now there's this big elaborate identity term.
Yes.
To describe normal psychology of a 13-year-old girl.
Yes. Developmental psychology. But because she had the flag and because other people were not accepting her identity, she's now oppressed. She feels different. She feels like the church hates her. The church hates people like me because I'm different. And there's church leaders are not talking about aromantic or polyromantic asexuals. We don't have sections on our website for that. We don't have general conference talks about that. So she has been erased. She doesn't have any representation in the church. She's alone. Adopting this label for what is fairly universal experience for a 13-year-old girl, all queered her so that now she feels very different, even though she's having an experience that's incredibly common.
Yeah. And it's a 100% contrived, artificial, unnecessary sense of oppression.
But not to her, right?
Right.
Her oppression is real. Her anguish was real.
Absolutely.
She wasn't making up her distress.
Right.
And that's the tragedy.
Yep. So multiply this by millions, and you have
Eric Kaufman.
Yeah. You have the Eric Kaufman study. This is what we're seeing among young people, millions all over the world right now.
Mm-hmm. So this is a great study. You should follow it. But what we see here is trend in LGBT identification by the age cohort. So you can see down here, I don't know if you can see this tiny line down here, but traditionalists that identify as gay have actually gone slightly down. The boomers have gone up just a teeny bit to 2.6%. Gen Xers, that's our Gen Dan, I think. It's mine for sure. We've just gone up a little bit too, from it looks like 3.9 to 4.2% or something. The millennials have gone from above 5% in 2012 to almost double at 10.5. Now look at Gen Z. They started much higher than the boomers are until now in 2017, and now they've doubled. Now, where are they identifying? Well, that growth is in the B and the other and the gender nonconformity. And you can see here how this is a lot of a female phenomenon.
Right.
Notice here, the interesting thing is the sexual behavior isn't necessarily growing as much as the identity is. People engaging in non-heterosexual behavior has grown from 4.8 to 8.6. So that's not nothing. That's quite a bit. It's a near doubling, but it's nothing like where we went from 5.4% to 16.3% of those who have a different sexual identity, but really aren't doing any behavior that's any different than they had before.
Right.
So this is more an identity thing than even a behavior.
Right. So when people say, "Oh, I'm a polyromantic asexual," they're claiming an identity, and there's this huge cohort who is claiming an identity and not behaving sexually in a way that aligns with their claimed identity.
Right.
So why would somebody do that?
Right.
Well, if you look at a lot of these social media environments where these identities are being promoted, you claim an identity, all of a sudden you belong to a club and you have standing in important conversations and you are validated, you are affirmed, you're showered with love and praise and all of these things that, a teenage girl just craves. Mm-hmm. Right. So it's not a lot of mystery around why there's that gap between identity and actual behavior.
Yeah. There's a lot of incentives here to do this.
Right.
Not shallow ones. Oh, I forgot this one. So here again, under women, bisexual identified women under 30 who have had only male partners. So you're bisexual and yet you're exclusively heterosexual in your behavior. Notice here the numbers I've circled. Where the growth is in bi, trans, and other. That's where these numbers have really gone way up. Go back to, remember the solvent Dan was talking about with queer. Remember the innate and immutable bit that used to underlie the gay identity. This is a different way of seeing it here now. These aren't innate and immutable things we're talking about, and yet they still exert tremendous power.
Right.
These are people that are strongly or weakly Democrat for the most part. If they're LGBT, you have a high likelihood of being a strong or weak Democrat, much more than a weak or strong Republican. You also tend to not be religious. And again, different data, same story. There's just look at how all those numbers have dropped. They're different measures and different samples, but all of them show the trend. Much less likely to be Christian and LGBT than you were before. The share of no religion of the under 30s has just skyrocketed. And here's the alarming one, is poor mental health outcomes.
Okay,
who cares?
So I want to pause right here, Jeff. Can you go back to the last image? Okay. This is an increase in no religious identification, but have these people stopped being religious? Not really. They have a new religion, right?
They've gone in the process of conversion, but they have not converted to. They've converted to the LGBT progressive religion.
Yeah, and it has its own assumptions about God. It has its own assumptions about what, sacred texts. It has prophets. It has rituals. It has all
sin
of these,
and redemption.
Absolutely, a story of sin and redemption.
A catechism.
Yep, it has all of these things. It has all of these elements of a religion. So they've shifted their former religiosity, if they ever had it, and moved it into this movement.
And that's fine, but let's be honest that it is a religion.
Absolutely.
You can't have, back to the main thesis I'm trying to convince you of, you can't have two.
Right.
You're going to have to pick if you want this LGBT, politically progressive religion, or an Orthodox Latter-day Saint, or heck, Catholic or Muslim or Jewish, pick it. You can have one or the other, but not both.
Right.
There are mental health impacts here. It is a female phenomenon in particular, but notice everybody since COVID has gotten more sad or hopeless.
Yeah.
It's gone up for everybody, and that's sad. But it's gone way up for these three. Look at the slope of some of these lines.
Yeah.
Not happy news. Unhappiness by sexuality. Despite the fact, right? When did Obergefell get announced? I think, anyway, it's 2014, 2015, around there. Despite the fact that now gay marriage is legal everywhere, there is a formal civil rights recognition to the LGBT identity.
So the story that we were told, though, was that it would increase their happiness.
Yes.
To have society affirm and validate their
identity.
Those identities. Yeah.
That was the whole reason. Anthony Kennedy said we're depriving these people of their dignity.
Right. And so the line should go the other way. So why is it trending upward?
And it did go down briefly between 2012 and 2015, slightly.
Right.
And then it had gone way back up. Within less than a year, it went up to where it was. And now it's up to 43% who are unhappy in the under 30s.
Right.
Now, the heterosexuals aren't doing so hot either, but this it's getting worse. Notice again, these are two measures, but they all again show similar trends. On this measure, this sample, you're more than double the chances of experiencing anxiety and depression if you're LGBT identified versus heterosexual. And to a lesser degree, you see also being very liberal and somewhat liberal are correlated with those anxiety and depression as well. It's not as stark, but you can still see the trend there.
Yep.
This is a study, it's very recent, but this is where in an empirical study, they queered their sample. They were able to convince some people to be less exclusively heterosexual. They didn't turn them gay. I think you could say they turned them bi or polysexual or pansexual, as what you could say. But through exposing these people to ideas about sexuality, it then had an impact on their behavior weeks later.
Okay, so it says in study 2, after exposure to fluid or continuous manipulations, heterosexual participants were up to 5 times more likely than controls to rate themselves as non-exclusively heterosexual.
They preached kind of this queer gospel to them and said, everybody's fluid, everybody's sexual, everybody's got ability to be aroused by a lot of different things. And that probably works because there's some truth to this.
Right.
But by telling them that, it led to some real world behavior changes.
Yep. And perception changes.
Mm-hmm. They embraced less exclusive hetero orientations. And the study here showed that they also expressed a greater willingness, see that last highlight, not only led heterosexuals to report less certainty about their sexual orientation, but also to express greater willingness to engage in sexual romantic interactions with members of the same sex.
Yep.
So they queered this sample. Fascinating. And this essentialist tendency plays in making members of such groups, heterosexual, more distinct from each other. So they just talk about, again, how they did this in this study. Did we change the sexual orientation of our participants? Surely not. Although self-perceived sexual orientation is partly informed by actual sexual romantic experiences, these experiences are filtered. This is what we will talk about next. So this is a great way to set up our next presentation, are filtered through a range of personal beliefs and attitudes. That means that 2 individuals with identical sexual experiences could report quite different sexual orientations. What is sexual orientation then? Oh, good question. The present study found that manipulating participants' beliefs about sexual orientation changed how they interpreted their sexual romantic experiences and the subsequent global assessment they made when rating their sexual orientation.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So what we're saying here is there is a narrative and a set of ideas that are applied to somebody's experience.
Yes.
That results in claiming an identity or having a willingness to explore different things sexually.
Mm-hmm.
And that narrative can be shaped.
And when that narrative is shaped, our own conceptions change, and then our own openness or closedness to other experiences also changes.
Right.
So what is the train of, again, it's funny because the LGBT construct says something you feel dictates something you are.
Right.
And then how you must behave.
Right.
But here we've said how you think about, how you narrate, how you understand that experience dictates your behavior, but also maybe your politics and your mental health.
Yeah.
And that's probably a good place to finish. Just you can sit on that, audience, and think about that.
Very good. So that concludes part 1, and we are not even remotely close to being done.
Come back
Very
next
good.
time.